This is the ABQ Business Podcast with your host, Jason Rigby. Each week we'll interview visionary business leaders to inspire the creative power and spirit that's in every entrepreneur. Discussing strengths, weaknesses, strategies, systems, and the problems we can all solve together for a new future for local small business.
How's it going, New Mexico? Super excited for the show today. I know we have a lot of things going on. We've had COVID-19, and then now we're having the issue with racism going on right now. And I wanted to bring somebody on, and the timing worked out perfect. I have Howard Ross. He is a lifelong social justice advocate, and he's the founder of Cook Ross. He authored a bestseller, Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Daily Life. He authored ReInventing Diversity, Transforming Organizational Community to Strengthen People, Purpose, and Performance. And his latest book is Our Search for Belonging: How the Need for Connection is Tearing Our Culture Apart. He's delivered programs in over 40 states and over 40 countries. He's been with Fortune 500 companies, major institutions, healthcare, government, nonprofit. He's led programs with Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, the Wharton School of Business, Duke University, Washington University. And I could go on. And I'm just super excited. I'm glad that you're here, Howard. And I want to kind of get into what your perspective of what is kind of happening. And I know this goes into your book and Our Search for Belonging, but what do you think is happening right now here in the United States?
Thanks for having me, Jason. I really appreciate it. My wife and I were talking earlier today, and she said the word for this year is going to be unprecedented. And I think there's no question that that's the case. Obviously dealing with COVID, and now what we're dealing with, all of these are circumstances that most of us have not dealt with, certainly in the last couple of generations. And,
right.
And it's quite extraordinary. And so, we can talk about each piece of it, but there's also sort of a general zeitgeist of what's going on, which is that our culture has reached a breaking point in terms of stress. And I think all of the strain that we've been going through over the course of the last 3-4 years, and certainly since the Trump administration took over, this polarization, which has been increasing and increasing, and has reached the point now where we're really like two armed camps of people in our society, and at the cusp of that is the experience of African Americans, who, as is so often in history, are right in the crosshairs of that tension. We know that this incident happened, this tragic incident that happened with George Floyd. But, it's interesting. The governor of Minnesota and the president the other day both tweeted these demonstrations are no longer about George Floyd. And my response was to say they never were about George Floyd. And George Floyd was the latest of the sort of the triggers that caused this stuff to happen. But the truth is, what we're seeing is 400 years of frustration being played out in the streets right now. And I think one of the reasons it's hard for us to understand between the races about this, and I'll particularly talk about this relative to whites and blacks, although clearly, Latinx people and Asian people get affected by it too, is that we see these circumstances in a fundamentally very different way, which is important for people to understand. And that is that most white people see a video like the George Floyd video, and, unless you really don't care at all about people, you look at that and you can say that's wrong. I mean, we all almost universally can say that that's wrong. And then we look back at some other similar circumstances, whether it was the Rodney King beating or Michael Brown being shot in Ferguson, or, the sadly hundreds of circumstances that we've had like this. And as white folks, we often look at this and we say, oh yeah, that's a bad thing that happened, and that's a bad thing that happened, and that's a bad thing that happened. And it kind of lives with us as incidents that occur that are bad. But for the African American experience, they're not incidents. The experience is an everyday, all day experience of feeling less than, of feeling in danger, of feeling threatened by leadership in our country, of feeling threatened by law enforcement in our country, that every now and again pops up to the surface for other people to see. So for every George Floyd that gets killed in the way we see, there are 500 African Americans who will tell stories about being rousted by police officers for no reason, having suspicion cast upon them for no reason, being physically assaulted by people, all of these kinds of things. And that's, I think, ultimately the difference in the experience that people have.
Yeah, and when you look at police violence and systematic racial profiling. What are you seeing at the root of that? Is it just our history that's in the United States, or what is causing this to be so divisive right now, especially now? And because you would think from the 1960s, we're at 2020 now. You think we'd have moved past this.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things is we've never done an actual honest accounting of the impact of racism in our society, and the recognition, the fact that our society was built on race, that the economic achievement of the United States would never have occurred if it wasn't for African Americans and all the free labor that they provided us during, the first essentially 200 years of our existence. That the law enforcement system in the United States was largely built on the system required to control African Americans from the time they were slaves, and stopping them from reading, stopping them from running away, stopping them from mating with people who they wanted to mate with as opposed to who we choose to mate with. All of the hundreds and hundreds of ways that the system of law enforcement was built around controlling African Americans. And then after emancipation, then we began to build through the 13th Amendment. We began to build structures of mass incarceration, again, to protect people, to stop Black men from looking at white women. Lynching
Right.
becomes a way to terrorize people. So it's important for people to realize that the relationship between African Americans and the police has had that tension to it for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and what now when you look at businesses and organizations, because I know that's what you do, and you do a lot of coaching, and you go in, when you're looking at like reform policing or accountability in an organization, what are you seeing if they're like, I know Starbucks came and they had an issue that happened, and then they turn around and shut the stores down, and then had training, and they had a famous celebrity come in and do the training for them through video. What are you seeing, downfalls and things that are happening that are effective that organizations are doing to bring awareness to this?
Well, it starts with this recognition that organizations are filled with people, and we bring in all the same triggers that we have outside, and the systemic racism that's impacting in our society comes into our organizations. And I think it's important for us to know the difference between sort of individual circumstances and systemic experiences. So, Starbucks is a good example. They had one person who did something in a store in one of their places in Philadelphia. That's one person out of roughly 250,000 employees. Well, there's no organization in the world that can guarantee that with 250,000 employees, nobody is going to ever do anything wrong.
Right.
And yet, to their credit, they said, well, this may only have been one person, but rather than simply firing her, we're going to use this as an opportunity to educate our entire organization. And they stopped, and they closed their stores for a day, and they cost it at an enormous cost to them. And they did put the effort into training. Now that's not the only thing they did. And anybody who knows what they're talking about will say that training is not the only part of any response. Training and education can be really helpful, but we also have to look at systemic structures, how we hire people, how we interview people, how we manage people, the way we evaluate talent. And all of those can have patterns of deep-seated unconscious bias in them that even good people, even people who are really conscious about this, can miss in ourselves. I mean, I know I've been working on this issue in my life for over 50 years. I'm 69
Right.
years old, and I went to my first civil rights meeting when I was about 15 or 16. And I still have times when blind spots will occur because these patterns of race, of treating certain people as others who are less than us, is kind of deeply embedded within us because of our life experience.
Right.
So organizations then, have sort of an opportunity to have an impact on this issue in ways that almost no other institutions in our society do. Because if you think about it, how many different kinds of institutions are there now where people are forced, whether they like it or not, to work with people who are different from them? Dr. King said famously that the most segregated time in America is on Sunday morning. We know that, that people in their religious organizations generally tend to be pretty segregated racially. We know that schools are almost as segregated now as they were in the 1960s. And so coming to work, you don't have a choice. Your boss says you and that guy over there are going to have to work on this project. And if the guy's different from you, you got to work that out. And so organizations become a real laboratory for us to look at how can we transcend some of these differences to find ways for people to collaboratively work together.
Yeah, and when you look at, because I want to get into your book, but and because I think this is going to be extremely helpful and it's relevant now. But when you look at, especially civil and human rights, and then on the side of a police officer who's supposed to be serving and protecting that, and then you look in the African American community, what is the justice system? What are you seeing in that? Are you seeing a breakdown in that, or where exactly? Because now there's this distrust, and I know there's always been a distrust in the African American community. But when we look at it now, it seems like if I'm on Twitter today, this morning, and then Instagram, we have, and the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that's like at the forefront, and everyone's talking about trust. What does that look like to you in an organization?
Well, I think it's not at all different than what it is at any other stage in our life. And an old dear friend of mine passed away a number of years ago. Lee Butler used to say that trust is to human relationships like cells are to biology and energy is to physics. I mean, trust is the fundamental currency of our relationships, and that's true whether you're talking about your spouse or your partner, or whether you're talking about people you work with. I think one of the challenges we have is if we really look at the African American experience in the United States, it's pretty understandable, at least from my perspective, that Black folks would be suspect often of white folks, or certainly of institutions that are run by white folks, because their lived experience is that they almost always end up getting the sort of the lower hand in
Right.
those circumstances. And so what ends up happening is we come into an organization kind of being very wary of concerns, of being very wary of being treated fairly, being very wary of having an opportunity like everybody else has. And there's no question that can also make our radar kind of more sensitive, so to speak. So if you're in a relationship, you have a partner. I'm heterosexual, so I'll say with my wife, if there's something about my wife, let's say I'm suspicious of her, seeing another guy or something. Well, every little thing that she does starts to pop up for me. Where did she get that matchbook? And, where did this happen? And why is that happening? Where was she this evening? How come she was 10 minutes late? Whereas if we were feeling really connected and I didn't have that concern, those things wouldn't even occur to me. So the history heightens people's sensitivity and makes people more aware of the various places where that trust breaks down.
No, I love that, and being transparent. I want to kind of get into why it makes people uncomfortable. Little quick backstory: I was raised fundamental Baptist in the South,
Mm-hmm.
so I had a lot of work to do. I'm 46 now, so I had a lot of work to do to get past that stringent religious system that they had. But there was a lot of racism built into religion,
Mm-hmm.
especially down south. When you see that, why does it make people so uncomfortable?
Well, first of all, I think that in our heart, we know and we say that racism is wrong. I mean, there
Right.
certainly are, there certainly are the people who are in the Klan and things like this who white supremacists, overt white supremacists who say that it's right. But for the most part, as a society, we've come to a determination that we want to that people should be treated fairly and that race should not be a distinction. And yet at the same time, we know that every human being has bias and that
Right.
race is a predominantly biased factor in our culture in the United States. So we're faced with this internal dilemma between the part of us that knows it's wrong and the part of us that really knows at a deep level that we engage in it. And so when somebody says something to us, the part of us that judges ourselves for having these feelings has to respond, has to defend itself. And this is why, often, ironically, it seems that there's some people who believe that being called a racist or being accused of racism is worse than racism itself. In fact, there's a scholar named Robin DiAngelo who has called this phenomenon white fragility. That there's a certain fragility that, how dare you accuse me of racism? Never mind that your lived experience demonstrates that racism.
Right.
You still shouldn't accuse me of it. And I think that comes into our organizations as well, because if you're an organization, Starbucks is a great example. Your organization has an incident like Starbucks had, for example. You could potentially, have brand damage that could cost you millions and millions of dollars. Now, Starbucks, because of the way they responded, managed to avoid some of that brand damage and by responding so quickly and forcefully. But, you and I could easily list a bunch of organizations that that have had that kind of brand damage and had to deal with it. So it's both personal image and organizational image that makes us very sensitive to those accusations.
Yeah, and one of the things that I know a lot of people that I know a lot of people sit there and have issues with, and I experience this because I'm trying to be really transparent because I want people to understand this, at a granular level. Like I wanted to post multiple times, like yesterday and today, and I was like, no, I'm white. I was raised middle class, in a Christian home. I've worked through all that and there, but it's like I really want to post this. No, I really want to post this, and so then a lot of people end up not doing anything instead of starting a conversation. So as a leader, would you take this opportunity to start a conversation?
Absolutely. I think this is the time to start that conversation because the truth is the conversation is going on anyway, Jason. The people in your organization have that conversation screaming in their head, and they're also talking with each other about it. They're talking to their friends about it. The only difference is it's all under the table. So I
Right or
always
wrong.
say, I always say, if you can't fix it, feature it. And get ahead of it. And one way that leaders can do that is by being very clear. Excuse me, very clear to take a moral position that in our organization, the kind of thing we're seeing on the news in terms of, whether it's the George Floyd circumstance or whatever, is just not acceptable. This is not the society we want to live in, and it certainly is not the kind of organization we want to have. And we know that if you are in our organization and you are African American, for example, that you are both grieving and probably furious and deeply
Right.
frustrated, maybe even resigned and hopeless because of this. And we want you to know we care about you, and we want to hear that. We want to give you an opportunity to share those feelings. And if you're white in this organization, we want to give you the opportunity to learn about this and also share how it feels from your standpoint, and the same kinds of concerns that you were just expressing, Jason. Can I say something about this? What's the appropriate way for me to talk to my Black colleague? If I reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about you and just want you to know that I really support you, is that going to be taken in the way I intended? And let's face it, we live in this sort of cancel out culture these days where if one person
Right.
says the wrong thing, then everything else they've ever done in their life disappears. So we can sort of understand why people are hesitant, but nonetheless, this is a time when we have to take a stand and speak out.
Yeah, because I think most people, and I know deep inside of me, my heart is right. So I know, and it's caused me to think, which is good. But I feel like the conversation needs to be had, and that leaders in their businesses need to be proactive. Would you suggest? Because I know you're an expert in this. Would you suggest getting your employees together in groups and let them have conversations, talk about public safety or what needs to change, or how can we change an organization? How would you facilitate that in a business?
Yeah, I think that putting people in groups and having them have conversations is a good start. And now it's one of those things where you say to people, I'm not sure you should do this at home. I mean, you want to be sure you know what you're doing, because obviously those conversations mishandled can cause more problems than they
Right.
solve. And so, it's important to, and I'm not saying that just so you go out and hire somebody. It may be that you turn to somebody that, sometimes in organizations, EAP function or employee assistance program, they may have somebody who has those kind of facilitation skills. There's skills that could be learned and taught, and we've taught, hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people over the years to learn how to facilitate those conversations. But one way or the other, the more we get stuff out into the open, the more we can deal with it in front of us, the less likely it's going to be pulling us from behind. When we get people in a room and we begin to really can question each other, can share with each other, can share the pain that we're feeling and the sadness that we're feeling, and really, I think it's important from standpoint of those of us who are white to avoid needing to have folks of color make us feel better. Sometimes in that sort of liberal moment, we want to tell people how heart-wrenching this is for us too, and we expect them to say, well, gee, that's okay. I know you're a good person, but that's work we need to do on ourselves. It's not work we should rely on our colleagues of color to do for us.
That's so good. I appreciate that. So, because this is, if you go on Twitter, you can see this a lot, with white privilege and looking at that. What is your view on that whenever you're looking, because I have no idea. I've never experienced any, I've never, even hardly ever been pulled over, and I can
Mhm.
run at nighttime. I can walk down an alley, downtown. I can drive my car past midnight. I can do all these things because of basically my race and not being profiled. What is your view on, as far as white privilege?
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you asking that question, Jason, because it's a concept that sometimes people misunderstand. First of all, um, white privilege is a systemic concept. It's not necessarily a personal concept. So you can be a white person, for example, and have grown up in very poor circumstances in an abusive home. White people have terrible things happen to them too. There are African Americans who grow up on the other hand. I remember I could share a story with you. I was doing a workshop a number of years ago for a utility company that I was working with, and we did this exercise where people were we were watching this video, and it was an old experiment. It's about 20 years old now. And some people who are listening may even remember having seen it. I think it was on 2020 or one of those shows. And what they did was they sent a white man and a black man out into various different circumstances, going to stores, buying a car, trying to get a cab. And they filmed them and watched the different ways that they were treated. And so we watched this video, and there was a guy in the group who was a white guy. And he responded by saying, "Wow, I can't believe that kind of stuff is still going on." And there was an African American woman in the group who was an attorney for the company who just eviscerated a guy. And she said, "That's the problem. People like you just don't pay attention. You don't see it happening all around you." And the guy's experience of it, he was sitting there, it was a little bit like the guy in the Maxell ad who's sitting in front of the speaker with his hair blowing back, that old ad, that was sort of it. He was like stunned. And
Right.
then a bit later in the workshop, we got into a sharing exercise where people were talking about their backgrounds. And this guy starts to share his story. And it turns out he grew up in Appalachia and was in a family that was so poor that he said his mother used to make lard sandwiches, lard on white bread, for he and his sister for lunch. And the way they got their clothing was the Goodwill truck would come to their school, and the principal would come on the loudspeaker and say, "John and Sally," for him and his sister, "the Goodwill truck is here with your clothes," in front of all of his, and he tells his story and he's weeping. And the woman who's still there looks at him and says, "I have to apologize to you. She says, "I grew up in Shaker Heights, just outside of Cleveland, the high rent district." She said, "Dad was a lawyer, mom was a doctor." She said, "I wanted for nothing my whole life, and I just assumed that you had it easier than me." Now, there are those anomalies, there are those circumstances, but on a broad scale, our consciousness is built on the notion that there's certain things that certain people have to do and others don't. You shared many of them, but I give one more example. I have 4 sons. When each of them got their driver's license, I had to tell them how to drive. I had to tell them, "Don't get caught speeding or your insurance will go up." But I never had to have the driving while white conversation with them. Like
Right.
almost every African American parent I know has had the driving while black conversation with
Right.
their child. What do I mean by that? If you get stopped, keep your hands visible at all times. Make eye contact, but not too direct eye contact. Ask permission before you reach for anything. If you're reaching for your wallet, say, "May I reach for my wallet?" If you're reaching for your registration, "May I go into my glove compartment to get my registration?" The whole list of things that you need to do, and that we don't have that, you and I, is a privilege. We don't think of it as a privilege, and it's not personal. It's like a rainstorm. It's not personal, but we get personally very wet in it.
Yeah, and I think there's a word that's really important, and in leadership, I would want you to speak to this, is this lack of accountability, because it's not just people of color. We have women, and I know you specialize this. We have gender nonconforming people,
Yes.
LGBTQ community now. We have limited English proficiency. We have people with disability,
Disabilities. That's right. Mhm.
ethnic groups, and you mentioned low income people. So we have, homelessness, all this. It's all seems to be like an underlying cause. And I want to get into your book. For time, I want to make sure that we get into this, but this thing of belonging.
Mm. Well, that's, I think, at the heart. I mean, I think if you listen to what people at the street are really saying, Dr. King said famously, "The riot is the language of the unheard." I think what you're hearing, if you really listen to people, is we want to belong to this society as full partners. We
Right.
don't want to be the other in this society anymore. We don't want to be the ones who have to watch out for themselves when other people don't. We don't want to be the ones who have to fight for survival when other people don't. And I think that that sense of belonging is incredibly important for us. When we did the research for the book, what we found was that most people probably know about Maslow's hierarchy, this model that Abraham Maslow came up with back in 1943. And it's probably one of the foundational models of modern psychology. And what Maslow said was you have to have certain needs met before you have other needs met. And he said, there was your physiological needs first, and then your needs for safety, and then your need to belong. And then above that, your needs for self-esteem. And then finally, self-actualization, where you really feel like you fully are in yourself. But it turns out that Maslow was probably wrong, that our need to belong is a primary human need. And it makes sense if you think about it, because, what's the most vulnerable time of a human existence? It's newborn baby. And newborn human babies need to be taken care of for longer than virtually any other animal on the planet. So
Right.
the first, we'll die in a few days if nobody's taking care of us, as newborn infants. And so the first imprint we get is I exist because you exist, whether it's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, or whoever's taking care of us. I exist because you exist. And this sticks with us our whole life, the need to fit into groups. And what's happened in our society now, and what we really address in the book, is that need for a group identity has split so dramatically in two polarized groups, or numbers of polarized groups, that our consciousness begins to be shaped by our way of looking at things only. So it used to be, from the political standpoint, for example, it used to be that you and I might agree on gun rights, but disagree on civil rights, but agree on foreign policy. Now we're
Right.
not even issue oriented. It's you're one of those people and I'm one of these people. And that, of course, occurs racially as well, that we begin to see ourselves more and more distinct. And we begin to assume that everybody in the other group is very similar to one another. There's a psychologist named George Quattrone who created something called the outgroup homogeneity effect he identified. And that is that when we're looking at people outside of ourselves, we tend to think they're all the same. So white people tend to think, African Americans are pretty homogenous. African Americans will often think that white people are very homogenous. Even though we know within those groups we could see profound differences, our tendency is to look that way. And when a group is threatening to you for whatever reason, and for the most part, white people do feel threatened often by African Americans. We know that we perceive them as stronger. We perceive them as more impervious to pain. We perceive them as more likely to be criminals. We perceive them to be less likely to be intelligent. All of these things that make people feel more dangerous to us. Then the notion of police taking care of us by controlling them feels like something that we need to do.
No, I love that. And so when what happened here, and I know it seems like it's happened in the last 6 to 8 years, and I know my father, he would, one of his best friends was, my dad was a Southern conservative Democrat, from old school days. His best friend was what he would call like a moderate city Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And they were best of friends, and they would go out and talk, and they would get into arguments, and they would have discourse, but they were inseparable. What what has caused this? It seems like there's just so much hatred in this us versus them.
Well, I think that obviously there's no one cause, but I think that, one of the big and maybe the most important distinctions are changes in media and access to information over the course of the last generation. When I grew up, there were really three sources of media: ABC, NBC, and CBS were the only, televised media televised news rather that there was, and it was all pretty homogenized news. None of them could afford to alienate half the population by taking a strong political point of view. And so they all had this sort of middle ground within a few degrees of difference. Not only that, but at that time, it was considered to be unethical for a newsman to have a point of view. It was considered to be, newsmen were supposed to report the news, and opinions were left to that guy at the end of the news broadcast with the white shirt and tie who would say, "This is an editorial," and we would give the editorial opinion. Now, not only is most of the news punditry, 80% of what we see is punditry, but on top of that, we go to different news sources. So if you watch MSNBC and I watch Fox, for example, we're not only getting different interpretations of the news, we're getting different facts of the news.
Mm.
If you watch the last couple of days, for example, and because I often watch multiple news stations because I want to see different perspectives, and just today watching CNN and then Fox, watching Fox for the period of time that I watched it, you would not know the demonstrations were even going on. They were barely covered at all, whereas that's the only thing that CNN was talking about. So where is truth? And without any shared sense of truth, that is, we can go, think back to Watergate. The New York Times and the Washington Post broke that story, and overwhelmingly, people in the country felt you could trust the New York Times and Washington Post. They're journalists; they're providing information. Now, you say to people, "Well, did you see this study? Oh, it was printed in the Post. Forget it. That's fake news." Or it was printed in Fox. Forget it. That's fake news, because the news is so characteristically different and driven by a point of view.
Yeah, and I've seen this before, and we saw this with the global war on terror when we saw Middle Eastern people. What creates that, inside of us, somebody walking through the airport, in the Middle Eastern, and then we have this fear, with 9/11 and everything. What creates that inside of someone? Is it just an automatic bias, or because I know you wrote a whole book on bias too.
Sure. Yeah, we do have biases, of course. We all have biases. It's fundamental to how we think. We select, what's good and what's bad, and we anticipate it and all of that stuff. But I think that there's something else involved in what you're talking about that deals with trauma. And that is that when we experience trauma, and in the case of 9/11, that's a good example, because we experienced a massive collective trauma as a culture. And one would say we're experiencing that now again between COVID and what's going on now with the protests. But let's use 9/11 as an example. There are a number of things that happen. What occurs in the brain is what Daniel Goleman, the Harvard psychologist who we kind of associate with emotional intelligence, calls an amygdala hijacking. So what happens is the fear center of the brain takes over. It's a highly protective mechanism. This is where fight, flight, and freeze come from. And we get very tuned in to potential danger around us. And one of the things we do at times like that is we tend to generalize. So for example, if we use Islamophobia as an example, I would say that most people know. Certainly there's a lot of misinformation out there around Muslims, but most people know, if you've got half a brain and done any research, that there are about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and very few of them have done anything aggressive towards the United States. Very, very tiny percentage. But to the frightened mind, it's easier to say, keep all of them away from me, than it is to try to determine which are dangerous and which are not. Right. And so, even though Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up Oklahoma City, and they described themselves as Christian warriors, we don't say all Christians are dangerous, because we're comfortable with Christians. They are like us. We're used to them. We live in a society that's predominantly Christian. But Muslims are the other. They're different from us. And so that outgroup homogeneity effect comes in that I was talking about before. And we classify all of them as dangerous because it feels safer than having to figure out who's safe and who's not.
I love that. And I want to make sure that I'm being respectful of your time. So I want to, talk about your books, and then also on how people can get them. And then one of the things that I want to kind of end in is, now that we're all uncomfortable, because I think that's the word,
Yes.
Is uncomfortable. And then we have fear and everything that's going on. What is the right way collectively to make change?
Well, first of all, I would say to people, be uncomfortable. Don't try to resolve your discomfort. Really turn towards the discomfort. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean perpetually and forever, but really look at that discomfort and think about, where is this coming from? What is it about this that's making you so uncomfortable? Where does my uncertainty come from? Where does my fear come from? Because what can happen is, out of that feeling of discomfort, we can just kind of turn away. So we turn off the news and turn on a sitcom because I'm tired. This just freaks me out too much. But the problem is, the people who suffer from this can't turn it off. I remember years ago, I met a woman named Alice Locke Kahana. My family background, by the way, is I'm Jewish. My family comes from Eastern Europe, and we suffered enormous Holocaust loss. Okay,
right.
So I met this woman. She was an artist who was a Holocaust survivor. When she was 14 years old, she conducted Sabbath services in the latrines at Bergen-Belsen to make sure that the children didn't forget their culture, which was, of course, a death penalty offense. Then finally, she was released, went on the long death march as they marched people back from near the Russian lines back into Germany, where she was finally released. And she said to me, one of the most upsetting things of that whole circumstance was when they were on the death march, and they would walk through these villages, that they would see people close the windows. And it's that sense that nobody cares that's most there. So I'd say the first thing is, let's pay attention to this. Let's observe it. If people can live the experience of having to worry about being shot, we can at least listen to them share that experience. We can at least watch that experience. We can watch that video and say, oh my God, this is the experience that people deal with every day. No wonder they're so frustrated. As opposed to, you're making me uncomfortable and I'll turn away. And then the second thing is to try to get to know people in their experience. I'm probably not surprising to our listeners, I tend to be on the left politically. I went out and interviewed over 100 Trump voters for my book because I wanted to understand people's experience, why, what it was that had them go do that way. And it was incredibly valuable because what I saw was that even though I disagreed with that particular point of view, and I don't like the candidate himself at all, that a lot of these people were good people who for some reason in their mind, it made sense to vote for him. It didn't make them terrible people. In fact, a number of them have become friends who I continue to talk with over time. So I think the more we understand each other, the more we know each other for who we are, the less we treat each other like what we are, the less we objectify each other. And I think that that's really important.
I love that. Don't close the window. I think that's amazing, and that's just a great analogy. So many times we want to hope that it just passes or it goes over, and we don't want to take responsibility collectively. So I do love that, Mr. Ross. How could people look at your work? How can they get a hold of you? And I know you have these 3 or 4 books that are out there. What is the best way for someone to communicate with you?
Easiest way is probably go to my website, howardjross.com. The company that I'm in now, I sold Cook Ross, the company I founded about 1.5 years ago, but we have another company which is called Udarta, Udarta. And I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook, so people can catch me there as well. Thanks for asking.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you, Mr. Ross. I really appreciate this. This is such a timely topic, and it's something that we all need to, as business leaders, we all need to look at this. And I hope that leaders will listen to this and re-listen to it and then take proactive steps so that we can be a better America.
Jason, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Albuquerque Business Podcast. And thanks to our sponsor, RigbyDigital.com. Make sure to subscribe and share. And go to abqpodcast.com. Get show notes, resources, and links to everything we talked about today to help you navigate your journey as an entrepreneur and business owner.